Room 7's call light lit up for the 8th time in 10 minutes. My eyes flitted from the screen to the light's intercom, and I sighed. I only accepted this job as a night nurse because I foolishly thought that it would be quiet. As it turns out, I was wrong. I pressed the intercom button that connected me to room 7, turned on my customer service voice, and said, "Hello, Mrs. Thrope. How can I help you this evening?"
"Oh, sweetie, it's Leona. I am not that old."
Her delicate voice rasped back. A quick look at her patient profile told me that this was a lie. Leona Thrope is listed as being 1,874 years old. She is not a spring cub by any means.
"I was just wondering if I could have my juice."
She continued. I glanced back at the clock. 11:48 p.m. Mrs. Thrope was not due for any of her medications until the morning. This included her insulin. But I had a feeling that if I did not oblige her with juice now, her call light would be in a permanent state of activation. I pressed the intercom button and replied, "I'll be right in." I stood up and crossed to the pantry, grabbing a paper cup as I passed the counter. Leona Thrope was not the oldest resident at Moonlight Manor, but she certainly was one of the neediest. I can't blame her though, she's a feisty old bear. I filled the cup with sugar-free Kool-Aid that we kept on hand, and for good measure I also grabbed a package of crackers. Before leaving the pantry, I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a vial labeled Wolfsbane from the shelf. I emptied 3 drops into the cup, and began to make my way to room 7. In my previous position, Wolfsbane wouldn't even be available in a hospital setting, let alone in a cup of Kool-Aid. But Moonlight Manor is not a normal retirement home, and Mrs. Thrope is not a normal patient. Mrs. Thrope is a werewolf. She is also dying. Moonlight Manor is a normal home for strange patients. Everything that goes bump in the night will need a place to spend their twilight years. That is what we are here for, to ease their transition into wherever they are going. Mrs. Thrope is a relatively new admission. The Department of Paranormal Entities, DOPE for short, transferred her late last week from the state infirmary. Like most of our patients, Mrs. Thrope does not have much to worry about in terms of life-threatening injuries. There are not many physical forces that can end the life of the patients that we care for. Mrs. Thrope fell victim to the effects of time. Not old age, but old atmosphere. Did you know that your body takes in 70 to 80 micrograms of silver? That doesn't seem like much, but to a being that's highly allergic, that small amount can and will build. For almost 2,000 years, the world that created Mrs. Thrope has slowly been poisoning her. When dope agents brought her in, it was difficult to tell what was wrong with her. As the days went on, the true toll that time had taken on her body began to present itself. First, she stopped eating. Then her transition stalled. Rather than transforming into her werewolf counterpart once a month, she was permanently stalled in her wolf form. Finally, her hair began coming out in tufts, and her energy began to dwindle. I hate to think of her as dying. Human or not, it's hard to come to grips with the idea that the patient that you are working so hard to care for is here because there is no more care to be given. I finally make it to her room. The door is shut and secured. It's really more of a formality. Mrs. Thrope is no more of a danger to others than she is to herself. Still, dope protocols state that all personnel who enter must don personal protective equipment. I gown up, put on a mask, and step through the silver door to enter her room. It is another protective measure. Despite her age, a bite from Mrs. Thrope would still infect the victim should she escape or attack anyone. I have always thought that this was ridiculous, given the fact that I have Mrs. Thrope's teeth in a jar at the nurse's station.
My, what a big mask you have.
Mrs. Thrope toned from her bed. I rolled my eyes. I told you she was feisty. Handing her the cup of Kool-Aid, I stepped back to open the curtains. The evening's full moon always brings her comfort. I had no sooner opened the window than I heard a sputtering behind me. I whirl around to find that Mrs. Thrope had taken a swig of Kool-Aid and spat it out unceremoniously.
This...
She choked.
This is sugar-free.
She threw the cup across the room and crossed her furry arms across her chest. Her nightgown only highlighted the fact that beneath her wolf exterior, Mrs. Leona Thrope really is just an old lady. Her glasses stayed perched at the tip of her nose as she pouted, staring at the door. I came to her bedside and did my best to clean her blankets before the stain sets. You know, Mrs. Thrope, the sugar in Kool-Aid does a number on your glucose numbers. I really think... Her paw shot out from under her blankets and grabbed my wrist. For one fleeting moment, my mind flew into emergency procedures. The panic button on the wall, the silver injection pen in my pocket.
I told you, my name is Leona.
She relaxed her grip and my heart slowed. She wasn't angry. She was alone. Her eyes reflected the moonlight back at me, and I realized that this is probably the most physical contact that she's had in years. I take a step back, still holding the crumpled paper cup in my hand. I'm sorry. I stammered.
Honey, I am the one who should be apologizing. I shouldn't have grabbed you.
I backed towards the door, ready to leave the room.
Wait.
She called.
Could you sit with me for a time?
I turned back to Leona. She was gesturing to the chair that sat next to her bed. It was meant for visitors. Not that she ever had any. Nobody comes to visit Moonlight Manor. It's not that they're not allowed. It's that they just don't. Some of our patients choose not to have children or families. Some families choose not to have their paranormal relative. For whatever reason, no one in Moonlight Manor ever seems to have any visitors. They come in alone, but they do not leave alone. Mrs. Thrope is waiting for a visit from Donald, our coroner. His name isn't really Donald, but calling him Death would be distressing. I am not sure how his department works either. The morgue is in the basement next to his office. I have never had a reason to go down there, or the courage to want to. All I know is that when the time comes, Donald appears. Sometimes he's called, and other times he just appears near a patient's room. The next evening, we have an open bed. I sat in the chair next to Leona, unsure of what to say. She twisted her head to look at me and then back towards the window.
You know, I used to be quite the young lady back in my day.
She murmured wistfully. For a moment, the tension in the room lifted. I internally groaned. Now she sounds like my grandmother. Oh, yeah? I teased.
Oh, yes. Have you ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh?
She asked. Of course. We had to read it for class in high school.
Well, the poet who wrote it, he fancied me. Funny what showing a bit of tale can do to inspire prose.
I blushed. Images of Mrs. Thrope laying on a couch like one of Leonardo DiCaprio's French girls was a bit much for me. I smiled.
What?
She teased.
Do you really think it far-fetched that I was able to charm a handsome young man? Wait until I tell you about Beowulf. He couldn't even get my name right in there.
Leona's smile was interrupted by racking coughs and sputtering. The moment of tension and humor evaporated as I was reminded of where we are, of why she was here. My pager began to beep, alerting me to another call light. Another patient, another problem. I stood to leave, setting Leona's hand back on the bed. Before I could close the door, Leona called to me one more time.
Honey, you are a dear. Thank you for the Kool-Aid.
And then, as if it was an afterthought,
even though it was sugar-free.
I laughed. Of course, Leona. Have a great night. I began to swing the door shut when all of the warmth fled the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked around for the source of the change. Standing right in front of me, in a black suit and hair slicked back, was Donald. He towered over me. Not menacingly, but his stance exuded power. I looked up and into his eyes, searching for a hint of light that was not there. His face is pale, lips drained of all color.
Excuse me, nurse.
His voice was a monotone drone.
I need to have a word with Mrs. Thrope.
He was not asking. He was telling me. He stood even straighter than he had been before catching the door as it was swinging closed. His steps made no noise. Mrs. Thrope made no sounds. And I cried no tears. I slowly walked back to my station and began the paperwork to open another bed in Moonlight Manor.